Hello, good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name's Hugh Stewart, and I'm going to look over the main stories tonight. That's on the 22nd of August. I'm going to be discussing the main stories. Our top stories will be on the economy, economic crisis, and inflation, and I'm going to discuss those with Linda Fabiani, former member of the Scottish Parliament, in a couple of minutes. Good evening, Linda.
Good evening.
Hi, and thanks for joining us in South Lanark sort of thing. So I'm going to begin with our Ukraine update. So first of all, we're going to go over the latest on day 180 of Russia's illegal invasion of their neighbour. Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB, has accused the Ukraine Special Services of carrying out the murder of the daughter of an ultra-nationalist Russian ideologue, Alexander Dugin. Ukraine has denied involvement in the car bombing which killed Daria Dugina on the outskirts of Moscow on Saturday night. A senior Ukraine official reported the denial of Kiev's involvement in the car bombing on Monday, arguing that the victim and her father were not strategically significant figures. Authorities in Kiev have banned large public events and gatherings ahead of Ukraine's 31st anniversary of independence from the Russia-dominated Soviet Union, which is Wednesday. People in the capital will not be able to meet in big groups from Monday today through to Thursday, owing to the possibility of rocket attacks, according to a document published by the Kiev military administration. Russia's illegal war with Ukraine is not going the way that Vladimir Putin hoped, according to the former head of the British Army, General Lord Richard Dannatt. Russian shelling in the Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine has killed two people, according to the oblast's regional governor. Russia is finding it difficult to motivate and add auxiliary forces, as they put it, to its regular troops in the Donbass, the latest UK intelligence update says. On the 15th of August, Ukrainian social media channels circulated a video that allegedly showed elements from a military unit in the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic refusing to be part of an offensive operation despite threats from commanders. Artillery shells rained down on the Ukrainian city of Nikopol, close to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, overnight. 25 artillery shells hit the city, causing a fire at an industrial premises and cutting power to 3,000 people. And finally, Russian missiles hit targets near Odessa, Ukrainian officials said. 5 Russian Caliber cruise missiles were fired from the Black Sea at the region overnight, the region administrative spokesperson said, citing information from the Southern Military Command. 2 were shot down by Ukrainian air defences and 3 hit agricultural targets, but there were no casualties. And now, Linda, let's look at our top stories today. We're going to focus mainly on the economic crisis. Now, the SNP today has urged the UK government to deliver what they call a pandemic-style level of support to households this winter, as the cost of living crisis continues to spiral out of control. It follows new analysis from Citizens Advice Scotland, which found that more than 1 in 10 clients currently require food security advice. The cost of living and income-related advice regarding utilities has increased from 26 to 35%. Views of cost of living and energy-related views on cost of living and energy-related pages on the Advice Scotland website have increased by as much as 122%. Council rented tenants and those unable or out of work or seeking cost of living advice more than any other group. Also today, a leading investment bank predicts that inflation could rise to a crippling 18.6% in January. The SNP has called on the UK government to introduce an emergency budget, which would include freezing the energy price cap, scrapping VAT on fuel, doubling the energy bill support to families, and offering more support to small businesses. Commenting, the SNP's Work and Pensions spokesperson Kirsty Blackman MP said, the UK government's response to the crisis has been nothing short of shambolic. Right now, food insecurity and utility bills are skyrocketing, and yet the Prime Minister and Chancellor continue to sit on their hands. There can be no more delays. It's time to act, and to act with haste. So, Linda Fabiani, good evening. Welcome to the programme. Thanks for joining us. Let's pick up on that last point that Kirsty Blackman is saying that the UK government doesn't seem to be interested. Is that your impression? Are they on the ball?
Well, they're certainly off the ball, but I would say that's a choice of theirs. Uh, Kirsty Blackman said that they're sitting in their hands. You've got a prime minister that's sitting in his behind away on holiday yet again. That man is still the prime minister of the UK. He's supposed to be in charge of the cabinet, in charge of the country, what's going on, and he's partying yet again. We have a Scottish government that's taking things seriously and meeting regularly in the Resilience Committee, but you have a UK government and cabinet that just don't seem to be doing anything at all. And I have to say, Hugh, I think that's a positive choice by them. They are choosing not to do anything, and they're laying all the cause of that on the leadership contest. Let's wait until we've got the new Prime Minister in post. This UK is not without a UK government. It has a Prime Minister in post, and they are just refusing to take any responsibility whatsoever. I think it's absolutely appalling.
Is the SNP and, oh sorry, I should really say the Scottish Government filling the gap of leadership at the moment? I heard UK media this morning quoting Nicola Sturgeon saying that they really have to start taking this seriously. They have to, in fact, our story says we need to look at the level of support that was provided during the pandemic. In other words, the
Uh-huh.
government needs to pump billions into the economy. And so Nicola Sturgeon was quoted not in the Scottish media, but UK media saying that's a level of urgency that's needed. Is there a vacuum of leadership, and is Nicola Sturgeon being listened to, do you think, throughout the UK?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon's doing what the First Minister of any nation should do. She is trying to look after Scotland. She is trying to do the best for Scotland and for the people who live here in Scotland. And I understand that the Welsh Government is doing exactly the same. The vacuum is at UK level. And yes, what is being said about the need for a pandemic style response to this is right. We are in really severe times. You've got the Citibank saying that inflation is going to reach more than 18%. I mean, I think the last time we were up there was the late 70s, early 80s. And that was full recession. We've got the Citizens Advice Bureaus, which I trust implicitly because they've got their feet in the ground, they've got their ear to the ground, they have people coming into their offices day and daily. They are seriously concerned about what's going on here. You're looking at wages where the percentage of it for fuel costs alone can be up to 40-50%. Horrendous. We need a proper strategy. We need a UK government that takes responsibility. Not next month when there's a new Prime Minister. What we need is a UK government that takes responsibility right now and should have taken responsibility right from the very, very start. We need that emergency budget. We need to look at solutions for this fuel and energy issue. We're talking about price cap freeze. I would want them to be looking at what other countries across the European mainland are doing and looking at much lower energy capital pay, looking at real solutions, at VAT reduction and looking after businesses because unemployment is going to rise if this carries on.
Yes, specifically what the SNP have been suggesting the UK government should concentrate on is, first of all, the cap, as you said. It's not really much of a cap, which allows energy prices to double and then go up again, is it? Some
No.
cap that. So they are saying, yeah, that should not go up. Now, in fact, they're agreeing with Keir Starmer. I think he said that today. I don't know if he's gone any further. Well, he has called for freeze, hasn't he, on energy prices? But is that enough? Is it now time to say that the market is a mess, the energy market is a mess, and it needs to be reorganised or perhaps even nationalised?
Well, I think what they have to do, first of all, is deal with the current situation. In the background, yes, let's be looking at how things are restructured. But it's crucial that something is done now to help people. There's people already in hard times. These figures from the Citizens Advice Bureau. People worried about eating day to day. People worried about making the choice between having their dinner and not sitting freezing in their houses. So we need immediate action. We need things done immediately to alleviate the situation. And yes, we should certainly be looking at the wider implications of the infrastructure.
Yeah, people are indeed worried, and so the figures we were quoting earlier on are, as you said, are from Citizens Advice, and so really there's been a doubling of the number of people who are calling them and asking for advice. So it looks like people are fearing this autumn and winter. People are wondering, how are we going to keep the house warm? So the UK government, and it's of course there are two candidates who are going to take over the UK government in about 2 weeks. So have you heard any of them, either of them, say anything positive about it? Are they even saying that this is an emergency? That's the word we have to use, isn't it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you've still got Liz Truss prancing about the UK telling everybody what a good job Boris Johnson's been doing. It's complete and utter nonsense. And neither Rishi Sunak nor Liz Truss have had taken any responsibility at all for Tory government since 2010. Neither of them have admitted they're a real problem or come up with any decent proposals to try and address this and try and alleviate the problems that people are having and are going to have even more seriously come winter. So, no, it's a complete and utter mess. All these two are doing is playing to their own party faithful, one trying to outdo the other in being seriously right wing. It doesn't help the majority of people.
Yeah, they are speaking to a very small audience at the moment, so I wonder
Yes.
what will happen once they have to start speaking to everybody else who's not a member of the Conservative Party in a couple of weeks. So just remind our readers, our viewers, of what the SNP has called for, as well as saying that's it, agreeing with Keir Starmer really that prices should not go up any further. The SNP has said, how about scrapping VAT on fuel? I think it's only 5% earlier, but anyway, but that would bring it down a
Mm.
bit. And doubling energy support. So it's quite possible for the government to actually put money straight into people's pockets. They can do that. And this current government and other governments, like the American government, just did it. Just get it straight into people's bank accounts. They can do that. They know where we live. Sorry. Now, the other point, of course, is that small businesses are not subject to the cap anyway. Now, is that a particular problem that you think more attention should be focused on? I did again. I was listening to LBC yesterday, and a guy who runs a cafe is saying we use a lot of stuff that heats food that uses a lot of electricity, and so that's going to be and those small businesses pay the full VAT. They don't pay the household 5% level. They spend 10%. But
Mm.
this guy's saying loads of cafes are going to go bust because we just can't afford to heat the food. Bills are doubling.
Absolutely. It's a vicious circle, Hugh. Now, there's already been a very prominent small business in my own local area that has decided they have to close down. And I think it's just one of the first of many. And it's a vicious circle because you were talking about cafes. Yeah, they're going to have more fuel costs. They may feel obliged to put their prices up because they can't cope with it. And when the prices go up, people have got less money in their pockets. People are hard up, so they stop going. So it's a vicious circle. And once it starts, it's a downward spiral. And I am really, really concerned for small businesses. So, yes, there should be support. There should be more support. And I don't buy this nonsense from the UK government that, everybody's got to tighten their belts. There's a proportion of the population that are not tightening their belts at all. And, we see that day and daily with the reports in the press and the media. So they could help. They choose not to help. But meanwhile, what really, really annoys me is the Scottish Tories and indeed Scottish Labour who keep trying to pass the blame onto the Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government has tried all the time to mitigate all the excesses that come from Westminster, and still you get Scottish Labour trying to blame the SNP for everything that goes wrong. When the solutions are out with the control of the SNP, they don't have the levers that allow them to deal with something as major as this. So it's about time that everyone in Scotland pulled together, all political representatives, started telling the truth about what's going on and fighting for Scotland.
Yes, of course, all energy is reserved to the UK Parliament, except for wind farms. We'll come to that at the bottom of the programme. Scotland has, of course, promoted wind farm use, but that's coming up later. Now let's move on to a second story, which we've already flagged up in the first story, which is that the Citibank has predicted that inflation in the UK will reach 18% early next year as consumers count the cost of the deepening energy crisis of one of the world's biggest banks. Citibank has made that prediction. The US financial services group, Citi, said it expects consumer price index in the UK to breach 18% in the first quarter of 2023, while the retail prices index inflation rate will soar to 21%. Citibank's prediction is significantly higher than the previous modelling of the impact of rising costs. Earlier this month, the Bank of England said it expected inflation to reach 13%, 1.3 by the end of this year, while the Resolution Foundation think tank has forecast it could reach as high as 15% as early in early 23. However, today Citibank said the inflation rate was likely to be even higher next year, with a peak of more than 18% in January. The US banking group is highly regarded for its economic forecasting, working with the Institute for Fiscal Studies think tank in its regular green budget analysis. The last time UK inflation reached 18% was, as Linda suggested earlier on, it was 1976, Linda, when an oil supply shock ripped through the global economy and left the UK seeking a bailout from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Benjamin Navarro, chief UK economist at Citibank, said its forecasts had been updated after a 25% and 7% rise, respectively, in UK gas and electricity prices last week. Citibank predicts typical dual-fuel tariff energy bills will be hit 3,717 in October, higher than most forecasts, which are between 3,500 and 3,700. Pound off gem, the energy regulator for Great Britain, will announce the level of its price cap at the end of this week on Friday. Okay, so Linda, a bunch of forecasts. So even the low forecast is that inflation will reach what, 13%, and others have said 15, and the worst that we've heard yet is astonishing, really, 18% possible by January. So this is just underlining, isn't it, what we said in the first story? We really are facing an economic emergency for Scottish people and for the whole of the UK.
Absolutely. And, all you can do is look back at what happened before. You were saying it was 1976, it hit 20. I think in 1980 it was down about 15, 16 or something in the early 80s before there was a turnaround. But what the Conservative government did then was they allowed unemployment to reach really high levels. And I can't remember exactly who it was, but I remember there was some Tory politician who said that unemployment in the north was a price worth paying for prosperity and this bringing inflation under control. You also had people having their houses repossessed because the interest rates went up as well, and mortgages were really, really expensive. And so then you had housing crisis. And I talked earlier about a percentage of income that's acceptable, for fuel costs, and it's far too high at the moment. It's not acceptable. The same happened with housing costs back then too, in the late 70s, 1980s. My real concern is that we get there again. We have this high inflation, they allow unemployment to rise hugely, and you have interest rates rising, which really hits the housing market again, and repossessions and increases in homelessness. So as I said earlier, it's vicious. It's not just one thing that goes wrong, it's everything, and everything is interlinked. That's why it is an emergency. That's why any decent and responsible government would be meeting day and daily to try and alleviate this and to try and head some of it off. Sadly, we're not. My big concern is that we're back to where we were a few decades ago with the Tories, which is that they just don't care. They look after their own small interest group and sod everybody else. And that's a huge concern. That's why we need this referendum. That's why we need Scotland to be taking this on.
Yeah, I wonder if a fresh path, a fresh way of looking at inflation is needed. You reminded me that back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, the dilemma seemed to be in policy terms either we have inflation or we have high employment. In other words, the weapon used by the Tories then, as you said, was to defeat inflation by increasing unemployment. But of course, this reminds me of what people like Mick Lynch were saying last week, saying it wasn't us that started the inflation. We know what
Mm.
caused inflation. It's high oil prices. It wasn't workers last year demanding higher inflation wage increases. So but are you suggesting then that the Tories really are going back to what they did in the 80s, saying we've got inflation, we have to deal with it by hitting working people? And are they looking at the right target?
Well, hitting working people and hitting people who don't work as well, because they've already hammered the welfare system. So huge concerns coming up here.
So indeed, we are kind of back to the 80s when it comes to economic policy. But of course, as we said then, the big problem in the 80s was kind of kick-started by a high oil price. So as I said, we will come back to alternative energy later on. Why do we need to worry about a high oil price if we make our own electricity? But we'll come back to that at the bottom of the programme. So undoubtedly, we'll discuss that again, Linda. The economic crisis clearly isn't going to go away soon, but something that will go away soon is the Tory leadership contest. Our third story tonight looks at what's going to happen in the opinion polls UK wide when the new Prime Minister takes over. The Tory frontrunner, Liz Truss, could give the government a double figure bounce in the polls once she's installed in number 10, according to the Labour Party's internal analysis. A memo drawn up by Keir Starmer's Director of Strategy, Deborah Mattinson, claimed that the Foreign Secretary could dramatically improve the Conservatives' fortunes. This document, which was dated 18th of August and has been leaked to The Guardian, comes amid speculation that Liz Truss might be tempted to capitalise on any upswing and call a snap general election. The latest opinion poll, Opinium is the poll organisation, and on Sunday they gave Labour its biggest lead in months of 8 points, while Starmer has surged well ahead of Truss in the last 2 weeks when voters are asked who would be the best Prime Minister. Yet this leaked analysis suggests that Labour could fall back again in the coming months as new Prime Ministers tend to boost their parties in the polls, a boost which then tends to evaporate perhaps into 3 months into office. We can expect that Truss will get a bounce of at least 6% if she simply performs in line with the average, and that would result in bringing polls level pegging with Labour, the report says. It's thought that Liz Truss could drive a 10-point or even a 12-point bounce, as Boris Johnson was such a drag on the Conservative polling in his final months in power. Bleak economic forecasts and the prospect of recession next year have prompted some speculation among Tory MPs that Truss could try to capitalise on any polling boost and announce an early election this autumn. She could use her planned emergency budget to deliver tax cuts and to announce support for struggling households, creating a short-term feel-good factor around her government. Okay, so let's deal with that last point first. So the Liz Truss solution to most problems seems to be tax cuts. But as you've suggested earlier on, some people who want to benefit from them, obviously pensioners aren't going to benefit much from tax cuts, nor are people who are not working. So some people will benefit from tax cuts. Obviously, people who pay most taxes, i.e., rich people. But is that a solution? Is that a way? What do you think of the general Tory idea that tax cuts will boost demand and it will get the economy moving? Is that the way?
It might work in very specific pockets of the UK, for example, the South East London and the South East, for very specific sets of people within these specific pockets. Um, Quite a lot of whom would vote Conservative, I would think. So no, I don't think it's an answer. I was really surprised when I read that report about Liz Truss supposed to give a big bounce, because both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak knocked one down at all well in Scotland, and increased the support for independence, actually. So I was really surprised, but then I thought, no, it's back to the old problem. It's one component nation part of the UK that is so much bigger than the others that both we get these results from, these potentials, and sadly, that the likes of the chief opposition, UK Labour Party, that's the only bit they really care about. And that's the problem. They're looking to win back their seats in the north of England, what they've called the Red West. So that's why they're worried about this bounce from Liz Truss. Doesn't apply in Scotland at all. I was glad to read that it was only temporary, and I was interested to read that they thought it might um, announce a snap election. I'm not so sure about that, but if it does, the latest opinion polls are showing that Scotland Party, the SNP, will get increased gains in that as well. So we shall wait and see. But no, I don't think Brexit is the answer at all, and I don't think Liz is the answer.
Right, so you're not convinced that there might be a snap general election because, of course, Theresa May tried exactly the same thing a couple
Exactly.
of years ago, and that she ended up in a worse position than she had been to start
Mm.
with. So that would be part of the strategy. However, this Labour Party briefing, let's look at the figures again. So Labour is ahead in the polls, UK, and that really means England. But it's thought that that 8 point lead could evaporate if Truss went to, well, that would have to be this autumn. She would have to call a general election really
Mm.
right away, wouldn't she? And have to have a general election in October or November. So you think that's probably unlikely, too big a gamble.
I think it would be too big a gamble for them. I really do. I mean, remember, you've got so many of the Tories who are really worried about their seats in the north of England. Very, very worried indeed. So I don't think she would do it. Happy to be proved wrong because I'm confident that in Scotland we would return SNP hugely, and that would be a big, big message, to be sending to whatever UK government came in, and would be looking to get, the majority of the popular vote as well as the vast majority of seats as we have already. So no, I don't think. I think she'll have a couple of months of being the darling of the Tory party down south, and then it may all start to go wrong. When it all starts to go wrong, she'd be frightened to have a general election until the very last minute.
So the most likely thing, of course, the Scottish Government has said that if the Supreme Court decides that the Scottish Government does not have the power, or Scottish Parliament doesn't have the power to have a referendum, it means that in fact the next general election will be a kind of referendum, but you think that's most likely to be 2024 and not in the next couple of
I would
weeks.
think so. I would
Yeah.
think so. We'd be hoping for a miracle.
Okay, well, let's see what happens next then. Okay, they're going to move on to another story now. So you mentioned the red wall seats, and of course that slogan is combined usually with the phrase "levelling up," and that's our next story. The SNP has accused the Scottish Tories of spouting shamefully misleading garbage over the UK government's levelling up fund. SNP's member of the Scottish Parliament, Stewart, said that no one can take a word the Tories say on this issue seriously after Rishi Sunak's bizarre boast that he robbed the poorer areas to divert cash to richer Tory voting communities. Ms Stewart also said that the Tories have form on this for Scotland, pointing to the UK government siphoning off money from the Highlands and Islands to go to Tory-held constituencies in England. The Scottish Tories, this is Cocker Stewart speaking, the Scottish Tories are guilty of spouting shamelessly misleading garbage when the damaging reality is that Scotland is being seriously shortchanged to the tune of £131 million this year alone. The funds are supposed to replace money from the European Union, which had been sent to the Scottish Government to spend on Scottish priorities. But since Brexit, the UK Government Levelling Up Fund bypasses the Scottish Government by paying money for devolved matters directly to Scottish councils. This year, the total being paid to councils is just 31 million, much lower than the 183 million Scotland would have received from the European Union. Cocker Stewart said that while Scottish councils will, of course, take steps to secure any funding available, Tory levelling up means that Scotland is losing out on transformational projects which bring significant benefits and communities. Since the Brexit vote, the Scottish Government says it has tried to engage with the UK Government to try to make sure these funds were delivered in a meaningful way, consistent with the devolution settlement and aligned with our national economic aims and ambitions. In bypassing the Scottish Government, the UK Government has been accused of dismantling the Scotland Act and undermining the devolution settlement by failing to give the Scottish Government any decision-making role. Okay, so that's the key thing about the levelling up as regards Scotland, and this is very different to England, isn't it? A red wall constituency in Blackburn or somewhere doesn't have that kind of added political dimension, but in Scotland, UK money is first of all not as big as the EU money it's supposed to be replacing, but also it's been delivered in a different way. So, do you see this as a sneaky attack on devolution because Scottish decision making is taken out of it? It comes direct from London.
I don't think it's a sneaky attack in devolution. I think it's a full frontal attack in devolution. They're not shy in doing so and talking about it. Yeah, can I say I was really, really shocked because I'm not in Parliament anymore. I don't get all the instant news and inside details about things like the levelling up funds and what were the European grants. I was absolutely stunned, Hugh. Uh, and you mentioned it that what CoCab Stewart was saying today is that we would have had £180 million from the EU in the space of time that Westminster has given 31 million funds. That's a heck of a shortfall. It's massive. And not only that, where the Scottish Government was always able, in conjunction with local authorities and along with COSLA, to take a strategic view on that expenditure, under the rules that came from the EU, because there were rules, but there was able to be a strategic overview on what was best for the country out of these funds. That's all been taken away in that direct attack on devolution. So it goes straight to local authorities who are all fighting their own wee corner, quite rightly, I'm not knocking that, fighting their own wee corner and trying to get things in their own areas. And there is no strategic overview on any of it whatsoever. So that's a problem as well. So Scottish Government's been cut out, the strategic view has been knocked on the head, the money has been cut hugely. I mean, that's absolutely massive. I'm stunned by that. And it's not only shameful and shameless from the Scottish Tories when they try and defend this. It is misleading garbage, as CoCab Stewart said, because all they do is talk about how bad the Scottish Government is, and they never ever look at the problems that are coming from Westminster and their own UK government. I can understand why they'd maybe want to keep quiet about it. I would keep quiet about it if it was any responsibility of mine. But it's the fact that they come out with, what Volkart has said is this shamefully misleading garbage. They actively, now let me think of the right terminology here, they're economical with the truth. If I remember rightly, it was a Tory that coined that phrase in the first place. They're economical with the truth, and they've shamelessly misled. It's absolutely appalling. And I don't know why this story that you have highlighted tonight is not all over Scotland's mainstream media complex, because it's absolutely shameful that our country is losing out to this extent because of these charlatans that are sitting at Westminster and defended by the charlatans that are sitting in
Well, that's why Broadcasting Scotland is on the air. We want to discuss issues that aren't really properly aired by the rest of the media. So that's up Colcap Stewart saying, on one hand, that the Levelling Up Fund is nowhere near as big as the EU funds it's supposed to be replacing. And the other thing is that the EU funds were given to the Scottish Government, and it was up to the Scottish Government to decide on priorities, but now it's up to somebody in London to decide those priorities. But of course, that really goes against the whole idea of devolution, isn't it? Which means that people make their own decisions locally. So we better move on now. Now, you'll be excited to hear, Linda, that chief executives of the UK 100 largest firms have seen their pay jump by 39% to an average of 3.4 million. Now that's per head, according to research by the High Pay Centre think tank and the Trade Union Congress, the TUC. Median average pay of chief executives of companies in the FTSE 100 rose to 3.4 million in 2021 compared to only 2.5 million in 2020, which was during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, when many bosses took a voluntary pay cut as they placed millions of employees on furlough. Chief executive pay has also surpassed the 3.25 median recorded in 2019 before the pandemic. The jump in executive pay means that the average UK chief executive now collects 109 times that paid to the average British worker, and that's up from 79 times in 2020. Sorry, I'm just pausing at those figures there to make sure we got that right. Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, said that the growing disparity between pay at the top and that paid to workers is fueling the cost of living crisis. She said, workers deserve a fair share of the wealth they create. By right now, chief executive pay is soaring. Right now, chief executive pay is soaring, while working people experience the biggest real wage falls in 20 years. These unbalanced pay policies have seen the gap widen between workers and bosses this year, adding to the cost of living crisis. Mr. Grady called for the government to introduce tough rules to rein in executive pay. The highest paid FTSE 100 chief executive, according to the research, was Sebastian de Montressus of Endeavour, which operates gold mines in the Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and Senegal, and he was paid 16.9 million. That's just himself. The second highest paid boss was Pascal Soriot of AstraZeneca, who was paid 13.9 million. 13.9 million. The TUC and a high pay centre are calling for reforms to regulations affecting corporate pay setting processes, which include requirements for companies to include a minimum of 2 elected workforce representatives on the remuneration committee that sets pay. Second, the guarantee to trade union access to workplaces to tell workers about the benefits of trade union membership and collective bargaining. And thirdly, requirements for companies to provide more detailed disclosure of pay for top earners beyond the executives and the low earners, including indirectly employed workers, enabling more informed pay negotiations at individual companies, and a clearer debate about pay inequality more generally. So let me start with the ratio of the average worker to the top. I'm just going over it again. A couple of years ago, the top chief executive got 79 times more than the average worker. You might think that's fairly big on its own, but the most recent figures show that's gone from 79 times to 109 times more. Can you see anywhere that's justified, Linda? You're struggling.
No. But it was everlast, Hugh. That is the structure that the UK has. That is the structure that has been allowed by successive UK, you know, and it's just the hypocrisy of it all, you know. Oh, I lose the words when we talk about this stuff because there's no justifying it. Absolutely no justifying it whatsoever. You know, when you've got people, and there's more than the top 100 companies, you know, when if you were looking at all the wider piece. Meanwhile, your average Joe is told to tighten their belt, uh, to stop being ridiculous, you know, in expenditure. You get public sector workers who are told they're not worth a pay rise of, you know, even up to the rate of inflation. Meanwhile, you've got a multi-millionaire guy who wants to be prime minister, who's going about the country and telling the Tory faithful that he did a really good thing because he took levelling up funds away from poorer areas and put them into richer areas. There is an elite establishment in this country for whom the status quo is fine and who are looked after, and to heck with everybody else that's a bit further down. So the calls from the TUC, of course, I absolutely agree with them. All these things they say, and there's models in other mainland European countries as far as employee representation is concerned, things like that. But these are the same things that have been getting said since I entered the workforce, you know, at the tender age of 16. And, you know, 50 years down the line, we're still talking about the same stuff. And that's why we need a fundamental change in Scotland to make things different here. Because things could be different here. We could make the
Yeah,
decisions of how we run our own country. And that's why independence is so important. And I would hope that our larger friend and neighbour to the south would start to make changes as well. Because I'll tell you, the UK as it is on its knees internationally as well as domestically. So they have to make changes, and they've been an awful long time coming. Let Scotland show the way, because when you're looking at this, you get people struggling to eat their houses, and you've got people earning millions and millions of pounds. Yes, they're doing a big job. I totally get that, but nothing justifies that kind of difference in pay scales. Because without the person working at the bottom, the person at the top wouldn't be able to succeed in the role they're doing. And just as a quick finisher, the guy at the very top, gold mines and everything else in Africa. Well, what about the workers in Africa? Oh my goodness. That's really the bottom of the scale as well when you look at the conditions in some of the mines in Africa and the awful work that some people have to do. The world is unfair. We could start by making it fairer in our own nation, and that's what I like.
Yep, of course, Scotland does aim to be more of a Northern European, more of a Nordic kind of country. Where I haven't looked at the figures, though, but I think I'm pretty right in saying that the inequalities in UK are wider than they are in most other countries. Certainly wider than they are
Yeah,
in the Scandinavian countries. Whereas you say,
yeah,
Linda,
and
work
widening.
referendums is quite common and getting worse. That difference
Yeah.
is increasing. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next story. Looking at the time now, we better move on. Now, closer to home now, Edinburgh North and Leith MP Deirdre Brock has called on Labour councillors in Edinburgh to take urgent steps to clean up the streets of Scotland's capital city as it deals with the effects of a 12-day strike by refuse workers. Festival goers are facing overflowing bins and rubbish lining the streets of the city after the Labour-led administration originally rejected plans to offer a 5% wage increase to its council workers. Despite residents demanding that the Labour council take action to sort out the mess, Labour council leaders were accused of being missing in action. The Labour Party, backed by the Tories and the Liberals on the council, are using and blaming the Scottish Government for the strike, despite the Scottish Government having given COSLA an extra £140 million to fund council workers' pay settlements. Ms Brock called on the council to support residents and tourists and solving the refuse problem. Deirdre Brock MP said, Labour's inaction is an absolute disgrace. The incompetence of this administration and its failure to put forward a decent pay offer when it was first called for risks making our capital city an embarrassment. The SNP in government put an extra £140 million on the table on top of the £100 million extra given to councils earlier in the year, yet Labour refused to offer that money to refuse workers for over a week, leaving our capital streets an eyesore. Residents and tourists alike need to see a plan from Labour to clean up the capital starting today. All we've seen so far is ineptitude. Have you been following that, Linda? So, what's the state of play? How
Well,
much is being offered? What will the council? What will the refuse workers settle for?
I mean, I've got no idea. I'm not part of the internal negotiations, but I did think it was very bizarre that when there was the potential for a 5% to be put on the table, that Labour voted against that and decided only to offer 3.5%. Now, and can I also say, I want it to be noted, I am really hacked off at the mainstream media on this, because every report I've heard about this disgusting mess that is our capital city during an international festival at the moment, every mainstream media report I have heard talks about the Scottish Government as if it's their responsibility. It's responsibility of the local authority, and that local authority is Labour, Tory, and Lib Dem. Now, that local authority by the SNP, and Labour were into coalition with the Tories. Something that their leader in Scotland, Anna Sarwar, said would never happen. They went into coalition with the Tories to actively stop the democratic will that the SNP should be running that council. Now they've allowed this disaster to happen. And as Deirdre Brock said, I'm hearing nothing from them. All they want to do is sit tight, hide their faces, and let the mainstream media talk as if it's the Scottish Government's fault. So, yeah, they should come out of hiding. They should get something done. What a mess.
Yet I do remember when there was a strike in Glasgow last November during the United Nations conference. I remember the leader of Scottish Labour was on the streets of Glasgow saying, "Why doesn't the council do something?" So I don't know if
Uh-huh.
he's busy this week. I haven't heard him saying that in Edinburgh.
Aye.
Well, we better just
Wherever
move
the
on now. You've been
SNP are, Hugh,
go ahead.
excuse me, wherever the SNP are, Labour want to blame them. That is the raison d'etre these days. It's about hammering the SNP. They should be turning their attention to Westminster and hammering the Tories for what's happening because that's the bigger picture. Sorry, just had to say that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. Well, I'll just move on to a couple of stories to finish because I was about to say the next story is about Fox News, and we have been talking about media quite a lot tonight and who decides what gets reported. Of course, Fox News champions the right wing and champions Trump. Now, we have an interesting story today that a former Fox News editor, a former politics editor, who was fired from that conservative television network shortly after the company's preferred candidate Donald Trump lost the election in 2020, he has said that his ex-employer failed its viewers with its election coverage. In his upcoming memoir, Chris Stewart says that Fox News stoked the black helicopter-level propaganda and hatred that fuels white supremacist groups and what translates into big TV ratings. Starwalt's broken news, why the media rage machine divides America and how to fight back, also reiterates the belief held by many that Fox fired him because he had always defended, even on air, his team's decision to declare Joe Biden the winner of Arizona in 2020 on the same night that the polls closed. The call enraged Trump, prompting the incumbent president, as he was then, and his allies to mount a pressure campaign aimed at getting Fox to retract that decision, while that camp pushed forth lies that the electoral fraudsters in other battleground states were stealing the election for Biden. There was no evidence for that. Of course, the New York Times obtained and reported an advance copy of the book. In his memoir, Mr. Starwalt maintains that Fox News' alliance with Trump and other Republican political candidates had nothing to do with ideology. Instead, it had everything to do with delivering ratings and fattening profits, without caring that its top-rated host, Tucker Carlson, endorses conspiracy theories that radicalize violent far-right white supremacists, including ones who staged the deadly January 6th attack on the Capitol. Starwalt says that his team's decision to accurately project on election night that Trump had lost Arizona to Biden in front of the audience who had been thirsting for the Republican incumbent to cruise to victory over his Democratic challenger came as a terrible shock to their system. The memoir likens that call to serving up green beans to viewers who've been spoon-fed ice cream sundaes for years. Steyerwalt also expresses disbelief that Carlson's viewers portray him as bravely discussing topics that are taboo to the mainstream when, according to the ousted editor, he's simply regurgitating the things that his audience already believes. Steyerwalt's departure from Fox News, where he spent 11 years, happened less than 2 weeks after a mob of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol in a desperate attempt to prevent the congressional certification of his defeat to Biden. A bipartisan Senate report has linked at least 7 deaths to that attack on the Capitol. Of course, we've commented on the Capitol attack and on the congressional inquiry, which still goes on. But this is an interesting insight into how Fox manages its news. They are, of course, well known as a right wing channel, but the guy they've sacked is saying it's really just ratings. They don't care one way or another as long as they get ratings and advertising revenue. So where is the morality in news broadcasting nowadays, Linda?
Well, there's none in Fox News. That's for absolutely sure. I mean, just about this chap that's got the doing the book. I'm quite interested. I'm always quite interested in what motivates somebody um, who has actually spent an awful lot of years doing everything that he's now saying was wrong. Because I think he was about 15 years or something with that channel reporting before he got sacked. So he'd been there a long time. Now, perhaps there was a Damascene conversion. and he suddenly thought, wait a minute, I can't do this anymore. This is completely wrong. That's a nice way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it, maybe he's just wanting to get publicity for his book. Who knows? But that's that anyway. Fox News is absolutely vile. However, I have real concerns about news generally. Um, Thankfully, we have nothing yet in the UK that is as bad as Fox News. But I'm really worried about some of the stuff on GB News, uh, which is internet, I think. I think it's only internet. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hugh. I'm really worried about some of the commentary that comes out on that, some of the complete nonsense, the conspiracy theories that are spouted by some of the presenters, and much as I have um, no uh, real sympathy for the BBC at the moment because I have issues with them. I thought it was really interesting that you have a Tory candidate for Prime Minister, likely to be the next Prime Minister, that sits in GB News and says things like, at least you get the truth here, unlike the BBC. Now, I think that's a real problem. I think that's a real mark of where Liz Truss and the Tories are going. And when you look at a lot of other things that are happening with the UK government about stifling news, I think we're heading the same way as the US probably did. There used to be some really proud US news channels that you got some great stuff from. Um, it has very much lessened in recent years, and I think Fox News is the epitome of that. I hope we don't end up here in at UK level with the same sort of thing, and at Scottish level, oh, it's not as bad as any of those. Of course, it isn't. But there are still issues that I have a problem with about things not getting either reported at all or indeed properly reported when they are reported. So
Yeah,
I think the whole thing needs looking at.
yes, it's come up a couple of times tonight, isn't it, and how the news media handles stories and what stories they decide to promote. I wonder what we would do if Scotland makes a decision to be independent. What would you do about broadcasting? Because the BBC often say we are criticised by the left and we're criticised by the right, so we must be getting it right. Well, everybody hates us. So, do you think Scotland needs an independent broadcaster if Scotland were a state? And because that's the main difference
Well,
between Britain and America. They're going for ratings, of course, because it's all private there, isn't it?
uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, I believe in public service broadcasting. I mean, there are things about the BBC that I really like. You know, I have issues with some of the reporting in relation to Scotland, but it is the UK national state broadcaster. You know, for all the talk about nations, regions, and nations, and everything else, it's a UK state broadcaster. For all that the UK isn't actually a state, that's how they behave. So I believe in public service broadcasting, and I would like to think an independent Scotland would have a public service broadcaster. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Then that's obviously another of the discussions that will come back. We're going to finish with one more story tonight, and I did say earlier on when we were talking about the price of fuel that we'll look at a good story actually about the amount of wind energy that Scotland is generating. Three projects are going to be offered seabed agreements for offshore wind projects, following the Crown Estate Scotland wind clearing process. The announcement comes as an offshore wind supply chain summit held in Aberdeen today, with Sir Ian Wood, chaired by Michael Matheson, MSP, the Cabinet Secretary for Energy, and including a keynote address by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Completely saw the NEI Area 3 to Shetland made available for ScotWind applicants who met the required standard but who did not secure their chosen location early in the leasing process. Highlights of the clearing results include a total of 14 applications were received, three projects have been selected and offered option agreements. The three projects' initial supply chain commitment indicates an average of £1.2 billion of investment in Scotland per gigawatt of capacity. A total of £56 million will be paid by the successful applicant in option fees and passed to the Scottish Government for public spending projects are currently expected to pay County Estates Scotland £4 million gigawatts per year operating, and this would also be paid to the Scottish Government. The area of the seabed covered by the three projects is just over 560 square kilometres, and out of about 751 which is available in the northeast. The three projects are expected to generate 2.8 gigawatts of electricity. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said ScotWind will deliver a new era in Scotland's offshore wind industry, representing the world's largest commercial round for floating offshore wind, and breaks new ground in putting large-scale floating wind technology on the map at gigawatt scale. It will provide several billion pounds more in rental revenues once projects become operational, to be invested for the benefit of the people of Scotland. Okay, so I hope that was clear, but a lot of wind's making a lot of electricity. So people keep saying these days, if we're making all this electricity out of wind, how come we're having to double and double the price we're paying in our electricity bills? Can you explain that one?
No, I can't explain that one. What I can say is that nearly 100% of Scotland's net electricity demand is already coming from renewables. That's something else that is never properly reported. Since we're on that theme, is the contribution that Scotland makes to the UK. It's also never properly reported about the price that Scotland pays, for example, to go onto the national grid. So there's an awful lot there. But this is good news as far as I'm concerned. But I think it's good news because it's part of the just transition away from oil and gas. But there's something very important about it that I want to keep an eye on, and that is, what the Crown Estate have said is that later on in this year they will be publishing the supply chain commitments. And I think that's very, very important as well, because one of these things doesn't just appear in the North Sea. There's all the supply chain stuff about who's making the equipment, where it's manufactured, who's being employed to do all these things, what companies are going to be part of this. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the supply chain commitments published later this year, because for far, far too long, Scotland has been in a position of not manufacturing, and I think there's big opportunities here, and I hope that we can take advantage of them.
Yeah, so already then the story is that Scotland is generating, really more than we need in electricity, and of course, as you say, Linda, it is actually an export, so that should actually show up as a Scottish export, and Scotland could actually be completely renewable. So that's actually a great, good news story to finish off with tonight. So I'm going to wind up now by thanking Linda Fabiani, former member of the Scottish Parliament, for joining us again. It's good to see you in the programme, Linda. And can I just remind everybody that before I go, we at Broadcasting Scotland depend on the generosity of our supporters. So everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up recently to make a regular monthly payment, thanks very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. You can look at the website on the screen below, and please look at that and sign up. We have a target. We want to add another 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff and make more programmes. As soon as we get the money in, we'll start making more programmes with it. Oh, and by the way, if anyone has looked at that lately, please see if there might be a reply from us in your junk box, in your spam. So have a look at that, see if we're in there. Okay, so that's it. So from me and from Linda Fabiani, thanks for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow. Good night.